G'day fellow flight simmers and random YouTubers. A few weeks ago I was asked by one of my subscribers to do a video on approach charts. So, because I like to please my subscribers, without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so as probably a lot of you guys know, there's different types of approaches, and for today's tutorial we're going to concentrate on Adelaide. Now basically approaches can be of two sorts. Can be the precision approach, of which there's only one, which is the ILS, as you can see by this chart here, or there's the non-precision approach, which can be, it could be the RMP, or it could be a VOR approach, or they're the main two non-precision approaches. I think the GLS is another one which you really can't use in Microsoft Flight Simulator. So today we'll be concentrating on the two main approaches. Okay, so as you can see here up the top it says the ILS or localizer runway 23. Now why would it say ILS Zulu or localizer? Because sometimes the ILS, as a lot of people would know, consists of lateral navigation and vertical navigation. So that's why it's called a precision approach. Now the lateral is obviously taken care of by the localizer, and the vertical is taken care of by the glide slope or the glide path. It's usually in precision approaches called the glide slope. So that's why you can still do this with the localizer and not necessarily with the glide slope, but we'll get on to that. So really what I want to do is, I don't really want to talk about, if you can see my, I think I'll just highlight, make it become more obvious. I don't really want to talk about, things like this, because that's just obvious. The ATAs, the approach controllers, the tower frequency, SMC frequency, they're pretty obvious, so you don't need to. But I do want to talk about the important bits, which a lot of people may not understand. Before I do that, the approach chart is basically in three sections. You have the plan view, which is all this section. Okay, so it just basically gives an overview of the approach, and then it's the profile view, what the approach looks like in profile, and then it gives you the minimas for the approach. So we'll just deal with them in one at a time. So the first thing, of course, is to do this approach. If you need the ILS, you need DME or GNS, as you can see, for the ILS, or for the localizer only, you just need DME. And we'll get onto that a little bit later on. So it's important. Now, if you can see, one of the most important things is getting the frequency right. And the Adelaide, when you dial up 109.7, you should see, if you're flying the 737, you should see IAD on your navigation, on your primary flight display. It'll give you, and if you tune to that frequency, you've got the Morse code, and so that's pretty sort of, well, I think it's pretty obvious. And also the approach speeds, ATC approach speed. So it says there nautical miles NM from threshold. At MOPRI, you should be doing, depending on the type of aircraft, you should be doing between 160 and 185, and 5 nautical miles, you should be doing 160 to 150. And you can see here if you have a look at this is basically where the approach starts from Virit, and as you can see it's signified there on the profile view, and Virit, as you can see there, it's 14. If you have a look at there, it's 14.2 DME. If it says, if you have a look at that, it's nautical miles to the IAD, which is the ILS. So, and it just basically, the most important thing you really, from this diagram, or one of the most important, is your course. you must set the course onto your, if you're flying, say, the 737, you must, or even any aircraft, that's the course you need to input 222. That is your course inbound into the ILS. Now, also another important piece of information is this one here. It's called, and if you look here, it says 25 nautical miles MSA. So what does that mean? Well, MSA means minimum sector altitude. In other words, if you look at this chart and you look at this ADVOR, which is that there, that's the Adelaide. From the Adelaide VOR, this minimum sector altitude, 25 nautical miles out, is divided into 3 sections. So if you look at the Adelaide VOR here, which is that there, if you have a look, you can relate this to the Adelaide VOR. You see the R350 here, that means radial. Don't forget, VORs emit, the headings, or for want of a better word, VORs emit radials. In other words, they go away from the VOR, the navigation. So if you draw say a radial of 350 from there and a radial of 149 to there, then in between the 350 and the 149 radial, the minimum sector altitude is 3,800. So what does minimum sector altitude mean? Well, minimum sector altitude is an altitude that will give you 1,000-foot clearance from the highest obstacle. And as you can see in this pinky sort of colouring system, if anyone knows Adelaide, these are the Adelaide Hills. So obviously you've got to be minimum sector altitude of 3,000. You can't be flying lower than that. Now, of course, there are exceptions, and I don't want to get too much into it. If approach controller gives you vector altitude, that's a different story. So, okay, so between the 350 radial and the 149 radial, the minimum sector is 3,800, and between the 149 radial and the 220 radial, which is roughly sort of there, in that area there, the minimum sector altitude is 2,700, and in this area here, between the 220 and the 350, it's 1,900, because obviously you're out in the ocean. So hopefully that sort of clears up for a lot of people. Now, that's probably the most important pieces of information from the plan view, or the top view. Now, I don't want to get too much into I don't really want to get into holding. You can see here, you can hold at MOPRI, which is a published hold, and if I start talking about that, you have to understand all these different entries into the hold pattern. I don't want to do that, because this is all about understanding the ILS charts. Okay, so the second part is where we're talking about the profile view, which is this view. So let's talk about this view. Now, the first really interesting thing is understanding what this chart means. Now, remember when I said that you can do the ILS, you can do the ILS, the full ILS, or you can do it on the localizer. Now, if you're on the localizer, it means you haven't got vertical guidance. And this is where this chart comes in. And it basically says nautical miles to the IAD DME, which is the localizer, or to the ILS, and the altitude and 3-degree approach path. So at 11.9, for example, you can see here, you should be at 3,800. At 6 miles, you should be 1920. So if you're not on the glide slope, you should be looking at this chart and equating it back to how high or how low you're flying, and adjust accordingly. So that's why they've given you this chart here. If you're not on the glide slope, then this is Oh, and another thing too, and we'll talk about the categories of aircraft, but if, actually no, I won't talk about it now. So from the profile, what can we see? Well, you can see at Virat, you should be less than, at Virat, you've got 3,800 with the line underneath. That means that you should not be below 3,800. And then as you approach Mopri, you're on a glide path in between 10.2 and 14.2, you should not be below 3,200. And then as soon as you hit the glide slope, just before Mopri, you should begin descent. And as it says here, you see there's your course is 222. Okay, now you get to a point where it's called, and actually I should also, you see this Maltese cross. That means that's your final approach fix. And it says here you shouldn't be below 1,200 on the localizer. What does that mean? In other words, final approach fix is where you should have your aircraft configured for landing. You're fully configured and be on a stabilised approach. If you're not stabilised, by law, you have to go around, you have to be on a stabilised approach, and there's all different criteria for stabilised approach. And you can see at that point at that point there, at the final approach fix, which equates to roughly just over 4 DME from the ILS. So that's really what this diagram is saying. And then this dashed line is your missed approach, or MAPT is your missed approach point. We'll go back one step. And that's at 0.7 DME. If you're not visual with the runway, you execute the missed approach and you fly a heading of 222. And that's summarised here in your missed approach. You track 222, you climb to 3,000 feet, or as directed by ATC. So that's really the most important piece of information. Okay, so next part is it's this part here. So what does this all mean? Category A, B, C, D. Okay, so the best way to know that is each aircraft has a certain approach speed to a runway. And your Cat A's, Cat B's, Cat C's, Cat D's. So what is a Cat A, Cat B, Cat C? Well, the best way I can show you is this. Your Cat A is the approach speed of less than 91 knots, and this includes your Cessna, your Diamond, and other similar aircraft. Your Cat B is your approach speed of 91 knots to less than 121, and the mid-size turboprops would be among those, the regional aircraft. The Cat C, which probably most people fly on VATSIM, is between 121 and less than 141, and that's all your 737s, your Embraers. And then your Cat D aircraft is your aircraft which do greater than 141 knots to less than 166, and these are your 777s, your Airbus 380s, all those sort of aircraft. So that's what that Cat A, Cat B, or A, B, C, D. So having said that, okay, so what do all these numbers mean? So you can see 270 and then 250 and 0.08. What does that mean? For all aircraft doing the ILS, doesn't matter whether you're a Cessna, this is your minimum. And the 270 is your barometric minimum, which is mostly what you set in your aircraft, and its barometric is above mean sea level. Now, as you know, not every airport is at sea level. You have airports that are, 2,000 feet above sea level. So what's the second figure? 250. Well, if you have a look here, Adelaide elevation is 20 feet. Miraculously, if you add 250 to your 20 feet, you get the 270 minimas. So the 250 is your height above the ground, because you've got the Adelaide elevation is 20 feet above sea level. So the 250 is your height, the minimum above the ground, and 270 is your height above mean sea level. And the 0.8 is basically your visibility. You need 800 metres of visibility. Okay, so what's the other? So you can basically, if you're on the ILS, in other words, on the localizer and the glide slope, you can get to within 270 feet or 250 feet from the ground, or 270 feet above mean sea level, which gets you pretty low. And then from that point, if you're visual, which most often are not, that's why it's called a precision approach. Now, if you're only on the localizer, you can see here if you're only on the localizer, so if you're only on the localizer, well, obviously the minimum is going to be higher. So if you're only on the localizer, your minimum should be 520, which is 500 feet above the ground, and you should have a visibility of 2 nautical miles to be able to execute this approach. And these, and the other one is obviously your circling, which basically means you're lining up for one runway, but you circle around the airfield and you land at the other end of the runway. In other words, you do something like this. You're coming in for this runway, and you're circling around and you're doing that. Now, obviously, also note you can't do any circling 4 nautical miles DME from Adelaide, because, of course, once again, you've got these Adelaide Hills, so you can't circle. So if you're coming in this way, that's the only way to do the circling there. So that's really a rundown of what the actual everything means, or what the most important parts of the approach chart should look like. So, okay, so having known all that, let's get on to the non-precision approach. Now you can see up the top, this is the R&P, the 2-3, and now the main thing here is, if we can look at this, if you're doing an R&P approach, then this becomes vitally important. You use this chart, you have to use this chart. With the ILS, it was optional, because only if you're on the localizer, you didn't have to worry about it, because the glide slope brought you down on the vertical path. But this, you got no vertical path guidance. So this becomes absolutely critical. You have to check that you're following this profile down to your missed approach point. So this, and now because it's a non-precision approach, everything else looks pretty well the same, really. You can see that once again your course is 222. Not really, there's nothing really there that I haven't covered in the ILS. So let's just deal with the now, as I was going to say, because it's a non-precision approach, this becomes even more important. Now, as most people know, you can do the RP, and you can use LNAV, VNAV, what they call LNAV, VNAV, and this gets you down to 430 barrow, or 410 feet above the ground. So you can see that has to, because it's a non-precision approach, by 410 feet above the ground and a 1.5 visibility, you have to see you have to meet that criteria. You have to be visual. So, and if you're on just the LNAV, if you're just on LNAV, then because you haven't got vertical navigation, then you have to have there's a higher minimum required. Now, there's another thing. If you're flying a non-precision approach, you actually don't set 430 on your barrow. You actually you've got to actually put in a buffer, and depending on your airline policies, I think it varies between 40 and 50 feet. So you set your barrow to about 480, because of course they need that buffer, because as you can imagine, descending, you're going pretty fast and it doesn't take long to go through 50 feet. So you can see that the only difference between the ILS and this is that, see, you've got higher minimas, but otherwise it's more or less the same sort of stuff, the same sort of information. But the critical part, of course, is that your minimums are a lot more higher. I think that's really it, really. I don't think there's much else to talk about. If there's any questions, put them in the comments below. And till next time, I hope that I've done my best to sort of explain most things. And if there's any question or comments, put them in the comments. And till next time, see you all later. Cheers.